Are you familiar with the Broadway musical Come From Away? It's recently been turned into a movie, and it tells the story of what happened when 38 planes had to land unexpectedly in Gander, Newfoundland on the days after 9/11 in 2001. How a community slightly smaller than Portage replaced tragedy with kindness and housed and fed 7,000 travelers on a moment's notice. It's a good story and an enjoyable musical, but it's also true. And it's a story that reminds me quite a lot of the gospel version, the gospel story from today. It's a story that appears in all 4 gospel accounts, although some of the details are slightly different in different versions. In Mark and Matthew, for example, the story comes explicitly after Jesus' own tragedy. He's just heard that the king has killed his cousin John, and Jesus is looking for some alone time to be in his grief. But time alone is not to be in all 4 versions of the story. The crowds, perhaps also in distress over John's death, follow him, and when Jesus gets to the other side of the lake, they're already there waiting. And Jesus has to decide if he's going to be compassionate or tell them to take off. Well, we know he doesn't do that. Kindness comes first. His disciples, on the other hand, are not quite as good at finding grace. And they're still pretty stressed by the crowds when supper time rolls around. After a long day of people, they're ready to be done with them. And the energy in the crowd is starting to concern them a little bit. And so they start to worry about where to find food and what they're going to do about an evening meal for themselves. It's the kind of anxiety that I think is pretty familiar to us these days. I think through the course of this pandemic, we've experienced all kinds of loss. We've had a lot to grieve, and we've also discovered compassion in all kinds of little corners and pockets. People have limited their interactions, they've sacrificed income, they've covered their faces, they've rolled up their sleeves to care for those around them. But after many long days of this, the energy in the crowd is kind of concerning. Election rhetoric, shifting health orders, they're stretching people's willingness to be kind. And as case counts around us rise again, so does that level of anxiety. The scarcity mentality creates anxiety all by itself. Stress and conflict and tension. And just like the disciples, we may be feeling like we just want it to end. Now, interestingly, the anxiety is only the start of the Jesus story, which turns out to be good news then and for us. Because the disciples are busy focusing on what they don't have and what's going wrong, their fear and anxiety is kind of paralyzing. And when the disciples say, "This is it, we're at the end of our ropes, we don't have anything, what are we going to do?" Jesus, not that all pastoral in that moment, says, "Well, don't be afraid, what have you got? Take a look." He comes at the situation from the perspective of God's abundance, and he sees in 5 loaves and 2 fish the start, the makings of a meal for the whole crowd. And instead of being overwhelmed by the problem, he starts small. What's in front of you? Take a look. I think these are wise words for our days, every time we feel overwhelmed and anxious. In fact, it reminds me a bit of a poem I discovered this week by John Rodell. It's also about the need not to be immobilized by our worries and our fears and the state of the world. It goes like this. If we treat our anxiety like a treadmill, we'll never leave our homes. If we aren't careful, we'll let our worries become a hamster wheel, and we'll just spend our days allowing our imagination to run wildly in place without ever actually going anywhere. That's no way to have an adventure. That's no way to visit the horizon. That's no way to explore creation. That's no way to honor our existence. That's no way to climb a great mountain. Instead, if we treat our anxiety like an ice cube, we can hold it in our hands for a bit before it melts through our fingers and down into the floorboards beneath us. We can learn from anxiety without letting it utterly control us. We can allow our worries a moment of our undivided attention. We can give anxiety a chance to pass through us before it disappears. We don't have to hide from our fear. We just have to give it an expiration date. If we let it, anxiety will hog the microphone like a drunken, rambling wedding toast that goes on and on until the champagne warms. It's important to give our worries a time limit, to speak to us like a cramping toe, like a brief raging thunderstorm, like an ice cube melting around our fingers. Don't let your fear grow roots. Don't let your worry sign the lease. Don't let your anxiety become a treadmill. Reject the hamster wheel of constant fretting. Let it come. Let it pass. Hold your cold anxiety in your warm. Give it your attention and then let it melt. Once it does, go dry your hands. Then open up your front door and get going. The great mountain is waiting for you to climb it. I'll meet you at the peak for a picnic. I'll bring the cupcakes. I'll bring the cupcakes. This is the miracle for me in the Jesus story. The way that he transforms a spirit of anxiety into a spirit of generosity. And where it seemed like there wasn't enough, it turns out there were leftovers. I think it was Dinah Shore who once said, "There's no hopeless situations, only people who are hopeless about them." And I think in this story, God, through Jesus, invites us to live our lives with hope, even in the face of situations that feel hopeless. 20 years ago, it was that perspective that transformed the situation in Gander, Newfoundland. So 20 years later, can you imagine ways that this story of Jesus and his friends can bring hope to our current context, can transform the life you are now living? I started with a story about an airport. Perhaps I'll conclude with one too. The American author Parker Palmer tells this story. He was en route to a conference when the plane he was on made an unexpectedly long layover at an airport. And a truck that was supposed to deliver the refreshments for the next leg of the journey broke down. And finally, the pilot decided it was more important to get his passengers on their way than to wait for the snacks to arrive. So he took off. And as soon as they were in the air, the passengers started grumbling. "A ticket is a contract," one said loudly, "and snacks are part of the contract." "I ought to sue," someone else muttered. A man stood up and said, "I'm a lawyer. How many are willing to join the class action suit?" A minor mutiny was in the works. And then something interesting happened. A flight attendant came on the public address system, and she began with the familiar information on such flights. The captain has now turned off the seatbelt signs. We have attained a cruising altitude of 30,000 feet. And then she said something quite surprising. Having served many of you on the first leg of this flight, I know that some of you still have your bags of peanuts, and you probably stuffed them in your pocket. How many do we have? 5? Please open them and share them with the passengers around you. I'm sure some of you have mints. Would you pass those around also? Those of you with newspapers, you can only read one section at a time, so spread the other sections around for others to read. Some of you are parents and grandparents. Please take the pictures of your children or grandchildren out of your wallets and show them to others. And with that brief announcement, the emotional climate of the flight was changed. Later, when the flight attendant came near Parker Palmer's seat, he asked her, "What is your name? What is the name of your supervisor? I want to write a letter about that. That was the best example of group leadership I've ever seen." To which she only replied, "The loaves and fishes still work." Yes, the sharing needs to be different now. You're not likely going to share peanuts from your pocket or the mints from your purse. The world has changed that. But it wasn't really about the peanuts, was it? The loaves and fishes still work. It is still possible to shift our perspective, to treat our anxiety like an ice cube, and climb this mountain together. The cupcakes are waiting. And don't worry, whenever we get there, there will still be enough for leftovers. May the teachings of Jesus find us where we live today. Amen.